Picture this, beneath the sunlit marble pillars and grand philosophies of ancient Greece, a shadow creeps one most history books never mention. While we celebrate the birthplace of democracy and the wisdom of Socrates, few dare to whisper about the blood-stained altars, the whispered curses, and the unspeakable rituals that thrived in the same streets. What if I told you that the same civilization that gave us the Olympics also practiced human sacrifice, that the temples of Athena once echoed with the cries of those chosen for the gods' wrath? Ancient Greece wasn't just a golden age of reason. It was a world where darkness walked hand in hand with enlightenment. You've heard the tales of heroism and art, but tonight we're stepping into the forbidden corners of history. Imagine walking through an Athenian marketplace, bustling by day, but by night haunted by secret cults performing rites so terrifying, even the bravest citizens barred their doors. Or consider Sparta, praised for its warriors, yet hiding a brutal tradition where children deemed weak were left to perish in the wilderness. These aren't myths. These are the truths scrubbed from the polished statues and epic poems. This is the side of ancient Greece they don't teach in classrooms. Over the next 25 revelations, we'll uncover the chilling practices, the lost horrors, and the whispers of a civilization as cunning as it was cruel. From poisoned oracles to political assassinations disguised as divine will, you'll question everything you thought you knew. So if you're ready to pull back the gilded curtain, to see what lurked in the alleys behind Plato's Academy, then stay close. Because history, it turns out, has been keeping secrets, and tonight they're finally coming to light. The Oracle of Delphi wasn't just a mystical figure, she was a lethal conduit of chaos. Perched on a tripod above a crack in the earth, her frenzied prophecies shaped empires and doomed kings. But modern science reveals a horrifying truth. Those divine visions might have been hallucinations from poisonous gases seeping from the ground. Ethylene, a sweet-smelling narcotic, and carbon dioxide, both found in the temple's bedrock, could have sent her into a trance so violent. Witnesses described her foaming at the mouth, contorting like a puppet of the gods. And when rulers clung to her every slurred word, the consequences were catastrophic. Take the Athenian general Xenophon, who begged the oracle if he should join a mercenary army. Her answer, a cryptic "do as you please," he interpreted it as divine approval, only to watch his men starve, betray each other, and march into slaughter. Then there's King Croesus of Lydia, who asked if he should attack Persia. The oracle famously replied, "If you cross the river, a great empire will fall." He did, and it was his own. Even Alexander the Great, who received a prophecy calling him invincible, later learned the hard way that the oracle never specified how long that invincibility would last. His empire fractured before his body was even cold. But the darkest twist, some scholars believe the priests of Delphi manipulated these toxic visions. When the oracle's ramblings were too vague, they'd clarify them, shaping wars, exiles, and even human sacrifices to serve their own political ends. So the next time you hear about Delphi's sacred wisdom, remember, the voice of Apollo might have just been the sound of a woman choking on poison. While Athens raised philosophers, Sparta forged weapons. Their infamous agoge system didn't just train soldiers, it manufactured human blades sharpened through unimaginable cruelty. At just 7 years old, Spartan boys were ripped from their mothers and thrown into a brotherhood of brutality. Picture a childhood where your first lesson was learning to steal food not for survival, but because getting caught meant a whipping for your clumsiness. Hunger was a teacher, pain was a compass, and the only graduation ceremony was surviving. The agoge horrors weren't random, they were calculated. Boys slept on beds of reeds they'd torn from rivers with bare hands, shivering through winters to toughen their flesh. Fights weren't just allowed, they were mandatory, with elders egging children on until someone bled. But the most twisted test, the crypteia, selected teens were sent into the night with daggers and orders, slaughter helots, the enslaved population that outnumbered Spartans 20-1. This wasn't just murder, it was psychological warfare. The boys learned to vanish like shadows, striking without warning, then disappearing before dawn. Some historians believe they targeted the strongest helots, eliminating potential rebels. Others argue it was pure terror, a way to grind compassion out of future warriors. And the cost, survivors bore the scars, both visible and hidden. Ancient texts describe men who couldn't eat without stealing first, who flinched at kindness, who saw betrayal in every smile. Even Sparta's legendary victories came at a price. An entire generation raised without love, conditioned to view mercy as weakness. The agoge didn't just create an army, it built a society where humanity was the first casualty. So when you hear Sparta praised for its military genius, remember, behind every shield was a boy who never got to be a child. Behind the poetic image of Dionysus as the god of wine and revelry hides a deity far more dangerous. His followers didn't just sip from golden cups, they tore animals apart with their bare teeth, danced until their feet bled, and surrendered to a madness they called divine. These weren't just parties, they were rituals of possession where the line between human and beast dissolved in the moonlight. The Bacchae, Dionysus' most devoted worshippers, were mostly women who abandoned their homes for the mountains, clad in fawn skins and wielding staffs wrapped in ivy. Ancient texts describe them entering a trance so deep they could uproot trees with their hands or shatter boulders with a single strike. But the most chilling accounts come from Euripides' play The Bacchantes, where the women, in a frenzy, mistake the king's son for a lion and rip him limb from limb. His own mother carries his head back to the city, still laughing, still lost in the god's ecstasy. Modern scholars debate whether human sacrifice actually occurred or if these stories were warnings against the cult's wildness. But archaeological evidence suggests the rituals were anything but symbolic. Vases from the era show figures holding severed limbs, and some rural shrines contain bones with marks too precise for animal butchery. Even more unsettling, the cult thrived in secret. Those who spoke of the rites risked being torn apart themselves, a fate that befell at least one Athenian politician who dared to expose them. Dionysus wasn't just a god of liberation, he was chaos incarnate, revealing what happens when civilization's restraints snap. His followers didn't seek enlightenment, they craved oblivion. And in the shadows of Greece's golden age, that craving turned holy ground into a slaughterhouse. The Olympic Games we know today, with their gleaming medals and strict rules, bear little resemblance to their brutal ancient origins. Forget sportsmanship, forget fair play. These contests were soaked in sweat, blood, and a desperation so fierce, athletes would rather die than lose. Picture this, competitors stripped completely naked, not for modesty, but because officials feared hidden weapons or charms tucked into clothing. Every muscle, every scar exposed to the crowd as they grappled in the dust under the scorching Greek sun. And losing, that wasn't just a setback, it was a disgrace that could follow you to your grave. Take the pancration, the most savage event of all. Imagine mixed martial arts with only two rules, no eye gouging and no biting. Everything else, broken bones, dislocated joints, even strangulation was fair game. Fighters trained to snap limbs like twigs, and matches ended only when one man raised his hand in surrender or stopped moving entirely. One legend tells of a competitor named Eleusinian who won the event posthumously. As his opponent locked him in a chokehold, Eleusinian viciously twisted the man's ankle, forcing him to tap out just as the lack of air killed him. The judges crowned his corpse with the olive wreath, a twisted tribute to his refusal to yield. But the cruelty didn't stop in the arena. Athletes who cheated or underperformed faced fines so heavy they bankrupted families, and the money funded statues of Zeus, each inscribed with their shame for eternity. Worse still, some cities punished losers upon their return. In Sparta, Olympic defeat was so intolerable, one disgraced runner allegedly hanged himself rather than face his people. Even winning wasn't always safe. Champions could be targeted by jealous rivals like the boxer Cleomes, who, after killing an opponent in a fit of rage, was driven mad by guilt and crushed an entire school of children in retaliation. The ancient Olympics weren't about unity. They were about survival, ego, and the dark side of human ambition. Behind the laurel wreaths and victory odes lay a world where glory was bought with pain and second place meant ruin. So the next time you watch the modern games, remember, the only thing more brutal than the competition was the price of failure. Beneath the rolling hills of northern Greece lies a tomb so mysterious, even whispers of its existence were nearly lost to time. The burial mound at Amphipolis, discovered in 2012, wasn't just any grave. It was a labyrinth of secrets, guarded by colossal marble sphinxes and walls adorned with haunting frescoes. Archaeologists who entered found bones, yes, but also something far more unsettling, a warning carved into the very stone. This was no ordinary resting place. It was a vault built to keep the dead from ever being disturbed, and if local legends are to be believed, it worked. The tomb's design alone screams of its importance. An entrance flanked by statues of twin maidens, their eyes hollow yet somehow watching. A floor mosaic showing the abduction of Persephone, a goddess dragged into the underworld. And deep inside, scattered remains of at least 5 individuals, one of them possibly Olympia's, Alexander the Great's notoriously ruthless mother. But the real terror began after the excavation. Workers reported tools vanishing, sudden illnesses, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. One team member swore he heard whispers in ancient Macedonian echoing through the tunnels, though no one else was there. Then came the deaths. The lead archaeologist, Katerina Peristori, faced fierce backlash and accusations of mishandling the site. Others involved in the dig met with freak accidents or unexplained health crises. Coincidence, maybe, but in Greece, where stories of tomb curses stretch back to Homer, few are willing to take that chance. Even today, parts of the Amphipolis complex remain sealed, as if the earth itself refuses to give up its secrets. Some say it's out of respect for the dead. Others insist it's fear, because in the shadows of those marble corridors, history doesn't just sleep, it waits. Sparta's glittering reputation as a warrior society came at a price, one paid in rivers of innocent blood. The helots, their enslaved population, outnumbered Spartans by staggering margins, and that imbalance bred a terror so deep it twisted into something monstrous. Every autumn, Sparta's leaders performed a chilling ritual. They formally declared war on their own slaves. This wasn't symbolism, it was a license to kill. The Crypteia, Sparta's secret police of sorts, would fan out under cover of darkness, hunting the strongest and most rebellious helots. But the brutality wasn't just about eliminating threats, it was psychological warfare. Some accounts describe Spartans forcing helots to dance while drunk, then beating them to death as lessons in humility. Others tell of mass executions disguised as festivals, where helots were lured into temples and slaughtered en masse. The message was clear: resistance was suicide. Even more disturbing, the Spartans turned murder into a twisted rite of passage for their youth. Teenage boys in training were sent to stalk helot settlements, proving their worth by killing with stealth and precision. Ancient historian Plutarch grimly noted that the best kills were those where the victim never saw the blade coming. This wasn't just population control, it was a systemic cultivation of cruelty, ensuring every generation of Spartans grew up viewing helots as less than human. But the darkest irony, Sparta's paranoia became its downfall. By constantly fearing revolt, they bred the very rage that eventually eroded their power. When Thebes invaded centuries later, thousands of helots seized their chance, abandoning Sparta to its enemies. The masters had sown terror for generations, only to reap betrayal when it mattered most. A civilization built on fear, it turns out, is always one uprising away from collapse. The pursuit of beauty in ancient Greece often came with a toxic price, one that rotted skin, ravaged minds, and turned vanity into a death sentence. Noble women slathered their faces with cerus, a paste of white lead and vinegar, believing it gave them the pale, luminous complexion of the gods. But this coveted glow hid a horrifying truth: the makeup wasn't just poisonous. It ate through flesh like acid, leaving behind scars, blackened gums, and bones so brittle they shattered at a touch. Take Queen Olympia's, Alexander the Great's mother, who was said to have skin like polished marble until her later years, when chronic pain and erratic behavior took hold. Historical accounts describe her teeth falling out, her hair thinning to patches, symptoms eerily consistent with lead poisoning. Even more tragic, the very women who could afford these lethal cosmetics suffered the most. A wealthy Athenian bride might apply cerus daily before her wedding, only to collapse at the altar, convulsing from accumulated toxins. Some physicians of the time noted madness creeping in, a condition they called the white disease, marked by hallucinations and violent outbursts. The irony was cruel. Greek poets praised delicate complexions, yet the paints that created them caused faces to literally crack and ooze. Archaeologists have found cosmetic containers in ancient graves with residue testing positive for not just lead, but mercury and arsenic, ingredients still used today in some skin-lightening creams despite their dangers. And the rituals went beyond makeup. Women tinted their eyelids with powdered malachite, a copper-based mineral that could blind with prolonged use, and plucked their eyebrows with razors dipped in toxic dyes. Perhaps the most haunting evidence comes from the skeletons themselves. Examinations of noblewomen's remains show lead levels up to 20 times higher than normal, with telltale pitting in the bones where the poison settled. These weren't isolated cases. It was a silent epidemic, one that transformed mirrors into instruments of slow suicide. So the next time you hear about the timeless beauty of ancient Greece, remember, behind every painted smile was a woman poisoning herself to fit an ideal and a society that watched it happen. The sacred band of Thebes wasn't just an army, it was a battalion bound by love, and that made them the deadliest fighters Greece had ever seen. Imagine 300 men, hand-picked not just for their strength but for the fierce devotion they shared. Each warrior fought alongside his beloved, a bond so unbreakable that commanders believed they'd rather die than shame each other in battle. The logic was chillingly simple. A man who would leap into spears to save his lover wouldn't just fight, he'd fight like a demon. Their reputation for savagery wasn't just myth. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, the sacred band shattered the illusion of Spartan invincibility, carving through elite forces with a tactical ferocity that left Greece stunned. Their secret, a battle formation that concentrated their rage like a spear point, driving straight into enemy lines, while their love for one another turned every loss into vengeance. But their greatest strength became their fatal flaw. In 338 BCE, Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander, barely 18 at the time, faced the sacred band at Chaeronea. What followed wasn't just a defeat, it was annihilation. Macedonian forces, armed with longer spears and ruthless strategy, encircled the band, cutting off any retreat. Historians describe the Thebans refusing to yield, fighting back to back with their partners until their bodies piled where they stood. When the dust settled, not a single man had surrendered. Philip himself, surveying the carnage, reportedly whispered, "Perish any man who suspects these men did or suffered anything unseemly." Archaeologists later uncovered a mass grave at the site, the skeletons still intertwined, some with arms clasped, others with skulls touching as if in final tenderness. The Lion of Chaeronea, a stone monument erected where they fell, marks no names. It doesn't need to. The truth was written in the blood soaked into that field. Love made them invincible until it made them martyrs. And in that paradox, the sacred band carved their legend into history, not just as warriors, but as men who chose death before dishonor, together to the last breath. The Eleusinian mysteries weren't just secretive, They were a psychological gauntlet designed to shatter the mind and rebuild it in the image of the gods. For over 2,000 years, initiates journeyed to the temple of Demeter outside Athens, where whispers spoke of a ritual so potent it erased the fear of death itself. But getting there meant surviving a nightmarish ordeal first. Picture this: you're led into a pitch-black hall, the air thick with the scent of burning barley and something sharper, a bitter, earthy aroma clinging to the back of your throat. Then the chanting begins, low and guttural, as masked figures thrust a clay cup into your hands. The liquid inside isn't wine, it's kykeon, a murky brew historians now believe was laced with ergot, a fungus that grows on rye, a natural source of LSD-like compounds. The effects were anything but gentle. Ancient accounts describe initiates convulsing on the temple floor, gripped by visions of the underworld. Some claim to witness Persephone's abduction by Hades firsthand, feeling the damp chill of the underworld's breath as their own bodies seemed to rot and reform. Others reportedly emerged convinced they'd died and been reborn, their old selves left in the darkness. But the real terror wasn't the hallucinations, it was the silence demanded afterward. Disclose even a fragment of what you'd seen, and the punishment was swift. Aeschylus, the legendary playwright, narrowly escaped execution when an angry mob accused him of revealing sacred symbols on stage. Lesser offenders weren't so lucky. Graffiti near Eleusis warns of a pit where the ungrateful were thrown, their tongues cut out before they hit the bottom. Modern excavations hint at the cult's darker edges. Archaeologists found traces of ergot in temple vessels, alongside skeletons with skulls cracked in precise, ritualistic patterns. One particularly grim discovery: a subterranean chamber lined with iron cages, just wide enough to hold a kneeling adult. Whether these held initiates during their hallucinations or punished those who broke their vows remains unknown. What's certain is that the mysteries didn't just promise enlightenment, they demanded absolute surrender. To drink the kykeon was to flirt with madness, and to speak of it afterward was to invite a fate worse than the visions themselves. The cult's power lay in its paradox. It offered immortality through an experience so harrowing it scarred the soul. Initiates left Eleusis changed, not just awed but terrified. Because the real secret wasn't how to conquer death. It was realizing that some truths are so devastating they're better left unspoken. The ideal of Greek perfection carried a chilling cost, one measured in the whimpers of newborns left to the elements. Spartan law didn't just permit the abandonment of unfit infants, it mandated it. Every child was inspected by a council of elders moments after birth. Too small, a limb twisted, a cry deemed weak, the verdict was swift. The baby would be taken to Mount Taygetos, a place so desolate, even the wind howled like a mourner. There, on the apotheke, the so-called place of rejection, infants were left exposed, their fate entrusted to wolves, storms, or the cruel mercy of starvation. Archaeologists have unearthed the grim proof. In caves along Taygetos slopes, tiny skeletons, some barely longer than a hand, bear no marks of burial. They lie where they were placed, limbs contorted as if still reaching for warmth. One particularly haunting discovery: a cluster of infant bones hidden beneath a pile of rocks, suggesting someone tried and failed to shield them from scavengers. The bones themselves tell silent stories: skulls with cleft palates, spines curved by birth defects, femurs so brittle they'd never have supported a warrior's weight. These weren't just rejections, they were preemptive executions dressed up as civic duty. But Sparta wasn't alone. Athens, despite its artistic grandeur, practiced infanticide through exposure, though with a veneer of discretion. Unwanted babies, often girls, were deposited in clay pots near crossroads, where passing travelers might take them or ignore their fading cries. Vases from the era depict mothers handing infants to slaves under cover of darkness, their faces etched with grief. Even Aristotle, the paragon of logic, coldly justified the act, writing that deformed children must be put out of the way. the darkest twist: some infants survived. A handful of ancient texts mention agoge, beggars who scoured exposure sites, rescuing children to raise as slaves or sell to brothels. One account tells of a Spartan boy spared by a shepherd who grew up to recognize his father on the battlefield and killed him with a spear thrust to the heart. A poetic revenge, perhaps, but rare. Most exposed babies vanished into the silence of history, their only epitaph the rustle of wind through Tegito's barren stones. So when we marvel at Greek statues of flawless athletes, we must remember their beauty was curated through blood. The same civilization that gave us the concept of democracy also practiced a eugenics so ruthless it would make modern dictators pause. Perfection, it seems, has always been a monster, and in ancient Greece, its feast was the innocent. Deep beneath the ruins of Knossos, where frescoes of leaping bulls once glowed in torchlight, lies a truth far more terrifying than the Minotaur's legend. The labyrinth wasn't just a myth, it was a slaughterhouse disguised as sacred sport. Young men and women, chosen as tributes, didn't merely wander the maze. They faced a ritual so deadly, even seasoned warriors trembled, bull leaping. Picture this: a ton of enraged muscle charging at you, horns glinting like daggers, while you're expected to somersault over its back like some macabre acrobat. The frescoes show graceful arcs, but the bones tell a different story. Archaeologists have uncovered skeletons with ribs shattered inward, pelvises crushed like eggshells, skulls caved in by hoof strikes. This wasn't entertainment, it was human sacrifice with applause. The Minoans cloaked their brutality in ceremony. Participants, often adolescents, trained for years to perfect the lethal dance. Some scholars believe the tributes were actually prisoners of war or political dissidents, forced to perform for the crowd's delight. Others argue it was voluntary, a twisted rite of passage where surviving meant honor and failure meant being trampled into the dirt. Either way, the stakes couldn't have been higher. At the center of it all stood the priests, cloaked in bull masks, chanting as the sand turned red. The bull wasn't just an animal to them, it was a god incarnate, and blood was its sacrament. Modern reconstructions reveal how easily these rituals turned fatal. Even practiced athletes struggled to replicate the fresco's maneuvers without broken bones. Now imagine attempting it in a cramped stone corridor with no medical aid and a beast goaded into fury by drums and spears. The Minotaur myth suddenly feels less like fantasy and more like a metaphor. A monster didn't lurk in the labyrinth. The monsters were the ones cheering from the sidelines, and here's the darkest twist. Knossos wasn't unique. Across Crete, similar arenas have been found, each with their own grisly souvenirs. One site yielded a pit filled with bull horns and adolescent remains, the bones arranged in patterns too deliberate to be accidental. Another held a golden axe, the same tool used to slit the throats of sacrificial bulls and perhaps on occasion failed leapers. The Minoans didn't just worship bulls, they weaponized them, turning devotion into a spectacle of death. So the next time you hear about the peaceful Minoan civilization, remember, their favorite pastime was a game where the penalty for losing wasn't just shame, it was your guts on the horns of a god. Persia's elite warriors weren't just feared, they were supernatural, or so it seemed. The Immortals, King Darius I's personal guard, marched into battle with an eerie uniformity, 10,000 strong, never fewer, never more. Greek historians like Herodotus whispered the truth: when one fell, another instantly took his place so seamlessly that enemies swore these soldiers couldn't die. The genius of this deception wasn't just in the numbers, it was in the spectacle. Each warrior wore identical gilded masks, their faces hidden behind cold metal smiles, while their armor gleamed so brightly it hurt to look at. To the Greeks staring across the battlefield, it was like fighting ghosts. The psychological toll was devastating. Imagine you're a Spartan hoplite, shield raised, sweating under the weight of your spear. You stab an immortal through the gut, watch him crumple, only to see another figure step forward from the ranks, identical in every way, as if the fallen man had simply stood back up. The effect was paralyzing. At the Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans famously held the pass, some accounts claim Leonidas' men began to question whether they were battling mortals at all. The Immortals' relentless advance, coupled with their uncanny replacements, sowed a terror so deep even the bravest warriors hesitated. But the darkest secret: the replacements weren't magic, they were meticulously orchestrated. Behind Persian lines, a second division of 10,000 stood ready, trained to the same lethal standard. When an immortal fell, a fresh soldier would don the fallen man's armor and mask, then step into formation before the body hit the ground. The system was so efficient, Greek scouts reported seeing the same faces unaging, unyielding year after year. Some historians believe the Persians even staged elaborate drills where dead soldiers would rise moments later, reinforcing the illusion for captured spies. The genius of the Immortals wasn't their skill with a blade, it was their mastery of fear. By weaponizing myth, Darius didn't just field an army, he created a nightmare. And in war, as the Greeks learned too late, sometimes the deadliest enemy isn't the one who kills you. It's the one who makes you doubt the very ground beneath your feet. King Croesus wasn't just rich, he was cursed. The last king of Lydia, his name became synonymous with wealth, but also with a darkness that clung to his gold like a shadow. His treasures, so vast that the phrase "rich as Croesus" still echoes today, weren't just spoils of power, they were a death sentence for anyone who dared claim them. The story begins with his downfall. When the Persian king Cyrus conquered Lydia, Croesus was captured and sentenced to burn alive on a pyre. As flames licked at his feet, legend says he cried out to the god Apollo, and a sudden rainstorm quenched the fire. Cyrus, stunned, spared his life, but the mercy came too late. Croesus' kingdom was ashes, and his gold, it carried the taint of his despair. The real horror began when Cyrus looted the royal treasury. The Persian ruler, eager to flaunt his prize, displayed the gold in his palace only to watch his empire crumble within decades. Next came the Macedonians, who seized the hoard after conquering Persia. Philip II, Alexander's father, melted down Croesus' treasures to fund his wars and was assassinated shortly after. Alexander himself, who inherited the cursed wealth, died mysteriously at 32, his empire fracturing before his body was cold. Even Rome wasn't immune. When General Sulla plundered Croesus' gold from Greek temples in the 1st century BC, he returned home to find his wife dead, his health failing, and his political victories turning to dust. Archaeologists have found eerie traces of the curse. In 2014, a team excavating Sardes' Croesus capital uncovered a vault filled with gold artifacts and something else. Hidden beneath the treasure was a clay tablet inscribed with a warning: "He who takes without the god's favor will drown in blood." Nearby lay the skeletons of 2 Persian soldiers, their bones twisted as if they died mid-fight over the hoard. Modern skeptics dismiss the curse as coincidence, but the pattern is chilling. Every ruler who touched Croesus' gold met ruin, as if the metal itself remembered its original owner's anguish. Perhaps the most haunting proof lies in the Delphi treasures. Croesus had donated lavishly to the Oracle, gifting solid gold statues and jeweled offerings. Centuries later, Roman Emperor Nero looted them only to face rebellion, insanity, and a bloody death. The few surviving pieces were melted down or lost as if the earth itself swallowed them. Today, museums display replicas, not originals, because the real gold, it's still out there waiting. And if history's any guide, the next person to find it won't keep it long. Some say Croesus' ghost still counts his coins in the dark, whispering to fools who dare reach for them. One thing's certain, his wealth bought everything except peace. And that's a lesson written in blood, not gold. The Lion Gate of Mycenae stands silent under the Greek sun, its massive stone lions frozen in a snarl that's lasted 3,000 years. But this isn't just an architectural marvel, it's a threshold to horror. Walk beneath those weathered beasts today, and you're treading the same path where Agamemnon returned triumphant from Troy, only to be murdered in his bath by his own wife. The stones remember. Locals swear the gate's shadows move unnaturally at dusk, stretching toward visitors like grasping hands, and then there's the blood. Workers restoring the site in the 1970s reported discovering dark stains seeping between the ancient blocks, stains that vanished by morning, only to reappear years later in the same impossible patterns. The gate's curse doesn't stop at ghostly stains. Archaeologists excavating the royal graves nearby described tools failing, cameras capturing blurred figures where none stood, and one chilling incident where a team member fled screaming that something had whispered his name in archaic Greek. The deeper they dug, the more the earth seemed to resist. One skeleton, believed to be a Mycenaean princess, was found with her skull twisted nearly backward, a position forensic experts say could only happen if her neck was snapped after death. Was it grave robbers or something ritualistic meant to keep her from rising? Even Agamemnon's gold carries a taint. The famous Mask of Agamemnon, discovered by Heinrich Schliemann, was hailed as a masterpiece until researchers noticed the eerie details. The mouth is a lipless slit, the eyes hollow yet somehow watching. Some scholars argue it's not Agamemnon at all, but a death mask for a far older, far darker ruler. Workers at the National Museum in Athens, where the mask now resides, refuse to clean it after hours. They say the gold grows unnaturally cold at night, and the empty eye sockets they glint as if catching light from nowhere. Modern visitors to Mycenae report more than just chills. Some feel an invisible hand tug at their clothes near the Lion Gate. Others capture photos showing misty forms clustered around the ancient graves, their outlines too human to dismiss. The most persistent legend that every few decades when the moon hangs low over the ruins, the lions' mouths drip red, a warning that the house of Atreus' bloodlust isn't confined to history. It's waiting, and unlike Agamemnon, it never died. Socrates' death wasn't just a philosophical tragedy, it was a political lynching disguised as justice. The man who championed critical thinking, who taught Athens' brightest minds to question everything, was convicted on charges so flimsy, even his accusers seemed uneasy. Corrupting the youth and impiety were the official accusations, but the real crime, exposing the hypocrisy of Athens' elite. Picture this. A city still reeling from Spartan occupation, its democracy fragile, its leaders paranoid. Into this tension walks Socrates, calmly dismantling every comfortable lie with a single question. What is truth? To the powerful, that question was treason. The trial itself was a farce. 500 jurors, ordinary citizens swayed by gossip, not evidence, listened as prosecutors painted Socrates as a villain who turned sons against fathers. Never mind that his so-called corruption was teaching logic and ethics. Never mind that Alcibiades, the most notorious of his students, had betrayed Athens long before meeting Socrates. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was silencing a voice that made the establishment squirm. Even the voting method was rigged. Jurors dropped clay shards into urns, a system ripe for peer pressure and snap judgments. When the verdict came, it wasn't close. 280 votes for acquittal, 220 for death, a margin so thin, it hinted at the city's divided conscience. The irony cuts deep. Athens, birthplace of democracy, killed a man for practicing its core principle, free thought. Worse still, Socrates' execution method was hemlock, a poison that paralyzes slowly, giving the condemned hours to reflect on their fate. As he drank the cup, his students wept, but the old philosopher stayed eerily calm. His last words, a request to sacrifice a rooster to Asclepius, the god of healing, a final, cryptic joke about curing Athens of its ignorance. The aftermath was even darker. Within years, the same leaders who condemned Socrates faced exile or execution themselves, their credibility in tatters. The city, ashamed, eventually erected a statue in his honor while still banning his teachings. Today, we celebrate Socrates as a martyr for truth, but the real lesson isn't just about one man's death. It's about what happens when fear wins over reason, when a democracy becomes so fragile it kills its own conscience, and in that, Athens' shame feels uncomfortably familiar. High in the rugged hills of Epirus, where the river Acron, named for the mythical river of pain, twists through the landscape, lies a doorway to the underworld. The Necromancy wasn't just a temple, it was a chamber of horrors where the living dared to summon the dead. Built over a labyrinth of caves and underground streams, its very walls hummed with an unnatural energy. Pilgrims came here starving, delirious from days without food or light. Their minds softened for what came next. They'd descend into the pitch-black innermost chamber, where priests fed them hallucinogenic beans and barley cakes laced with narcotics, then left them alone in the darkness. That's when the voices began. Ancient accounts describe whispers rising from the stone itself, some recognizable as lost loved ones, others guttural and alien. One visitor, a soldier seeking guidance from his fallen brother, reported the air turning frigid as a spectral hand gripped his wrist, leaving bruises that lasted weeks. Another, a merchant's wife desperate to know if her deceased child was at peace, fled screaming when a chorus of children's laughter erupted from the walls, growing louder until it became screams. But the most chilling record comes from a Spartan general who entered seeking tactical advice from a legendary commander. The shade supposedly showed him a vision of his own death, accurate in every detail, down to the spear wound in his side. He died exactly as foretold 3 months later. Modern excavations confirm the temple's eerie acoustics. The underground channels amplify even the faintest sounds, warping them into otherworldly echoes. Worse, soil samples reveal traces of henbane and nightshade plants that induce visions of phantoms. Archaeologists also uncovered niches in the walls where priests likely hid to whisper messages from the dead, and a hidden pit filled with animal bones, likely used to simulate the touch of specters with cold, rotting hands. Yet some details defy explanation. Visitors described seeing the same long-dead priestess in their visions, a woman not recorded in any historical texts until her face was found carved into a buried altar stone. Others swore the temple's guardian statue wept black tears on certain nights, a phenomenon later matched by residue analysis showing iron-rich water seeping through its marble. Whether it was elaborate theater, genuine psychosis, or something far older and darker, one truth remains: those who entered the Necromancy didn't just speak to the dead. They brought something back with them, and in the silence that followed, the shadows always seemed hungrier. Long before Vikings stalked the northern seas, an even more terrifying force emerged from the Mediterranean's uncharted waters: the Sea Peoples. Their name sounds almost quaint, but make no mistake, these were the boogeymen of the Bronze Age, shadowy raiders who reduced mighty civilizations to ash and memory. Around 1200 BCE, coastal cities across Greece and Anatolia began reporting the same nightmare. Black-sailed ships appearing at dawn, disgorging warriors clad in strange, feathered helmets. They fought like demons, wielding curved swords that could slice through bronze armor as if it were parchment. The aftermath was always the same: smoldering temples, slaughtered nobles, and entire populations dragged away in chains. One of their most devastating strikes hit Pylos, a wealthy Mycenaean kingdom. Archaeologists found its palace archives abruptly ending with frantic clay tablets describing watchers by the sea spotting the invaders. Then nothing. The next layer is just charred rubble and scattered bones, some still clutching weapons in a futile last stand. Similar scenes played out from Troy to Cyprus. At Ugarit, a desperate plea for help was found still in its clay envelope, never sent. The city burned before the messenger could flee, but who were they? Theories range from climate refugees to mercenary armies gone rogue. Some scholars link them to Sardinia based on distinctive horned helmets found in carvings. Others point to ancient Egyptian reliefs showing captured sea peoples with uncanny similarities to Greek and Anatolian features, suggesting they might have been displaced by earlier disasters like the Thur eruption. The darkest possibility, they weren't a single group at all, but a wave of desperate migrations and opportunistic warlords, feeding on collapsing civilizations like vultures on a dying beast. Their ultimate legacy was written in ruins. The Sea Peoples didn't just sack cities, they unraveled trade networks, toppled kings, and likely hastened the Bronze Age's collapse. After their rampage, Greece plunged into a 300-year dark age where writing vanished and populations plummeted. The survivors told stories of a time when the sea itself turned against them, a warning that echoes in every tsunami siren today. Because the terrifying truth about the Sea Peoples isn't just their violence, it's how completely they proved civilization is always one bad harvest, one invasion, one perfect storm away from extinction. On the sun-drenched island of Lesbos, where the Aegean waves still whisper her name, Sappho's verses ignited a fire that threatened to burn through history itself. Her poetry wasn't just beautiful, it was revolutionary, painting love between women with a tenderness and passion that scandalized later generations. Imagine scrolls filled with lines like "You burn me" and "Like the sweet apple reddening on the highest branch," words so vivid they made ancient scholars blush. But this wasn't just about desire, it was about a woman claiming space in a world determined to silence her, and the backlash was swift and brutal. By the medieval period, church officials were systematically destroying her work, labeling it obscene. What survived was often censored or rewritten poems addressed to women clumsily altered to include male names or worse, branded as teaching tools rather than expressions of genuine love. Even Plato, who called her the 10th Muse, couldn't shield her legacy from puritanical scrubbing. The irony, much of what we know about Sappho comes from fragments, scraps of papyrus pulled from Egyptian trash heaps or used as mummy wrappings, as if her words were literally buried with the dead. The most chilling example of this erasure lies in Constantinople in the year 1073, when church authorities burned an entire library of her poems. One account describes scholars rescuing a single book by tossing it out a window only for a mob to tear it apart in the street. Yet fragments persisted, hidden in private collections or quoted by other writers just often enough to tease what was lost. A full 12 lines might survive from one poem, then just a single aching phrase from another. "I simply want to be dead." Modern translations reveal what terrified her critics most. Sappho's love wasn't shameful or secretive. It was joyful, divine, and unapologetic. She wrote of weddings and goddesses, jealousy and longing, with a voice so distinct it defied categorization. Later moralists tried to recast her as a tragic figure, a suicidal heterosexual plagued by unrequited love for a ferryman named Phaon. This fabricated myth stuck for centuries, distorting her image until the Victorian era, when scholars began piecing together the truth from charred fragments and ancient gossip. The real tragedy isn't just the loss of her words, it's what their suppression cost us. Sappho's work could have reshaped Western attitudes toward love and gender millennia earlier. Instead, we're left with echoes, a woman standing on a cliff singing to the waves while history tries and fails to drown her out. Her legacy is a warning not just about love, but about who gets to write the story and how easily the victors can erase what makes them uncomfortable. Yet somehow, through fire and censorship, her voice still burns, and that perhaps is the most radical act of all. Deep in the mountains of Arcadia, where the pines grew so thick they choked out the sun, a cult practiced rites so horrifying even other Greeks avoided speaking of them. At the altar of Zeus, Lycaos Zeus the wolf, men gathered under the full moon not just to worship but to transform. The ritual was simple, brutal, and utterly inhuman. A single piece of human flesh cut from a sacrificed child or prisoner would be mixed into the ceremonial stew. Those who ate it, the priests claimed, would shed their humanity like a second skin. For 8 years they would roam as wolves, hunting under the cover of darkness, and if they resisted the urge to taste human meat again during that time, only then could they return to society as men. Ancient sources like Plato and Pausanias describe the cult in hushed tones, noting how initiates would vanish into the wilderness wearing wolf pelts, their eyes reflecting firelight a little too brightly. Some never came back. Those who did often bore scars no animal could leave, finger-shaped bruises around their throats, teeth marks on their own arms. The Arcadians whispered of villagers finding half-eaten corpses with wolf tracks leading right up to the victim and human footprints leading away. But the darkest twist isn't the cannibalism, it's how deeply this ritual bled into European folklore. The cult's practices mirror werewolf legends down to eerie details, the full moon triggering the change, the idea that tasting human flesh damns you to beasthood, even the 8-year curse, a number sacred to Zeus. Even the word lycanthropy comes from Lycaeo's mountain. Modern historians suspect the cult's initiates didn't physically transform, but entered drug-induced frenzies. Henbane and belladonna grow wild in Arcadia, both known to cause hallucinations of fur sprouting and bones cracking. Archaeologists uncovered physical proof at Mount Lycaon in 2016. Beneath the altar, they found a child's skeleton missing a femur, the bone cleanly cut with a blade. Nearby, charred cooking pots tested positive for human blood proteins, but the most disturbing find, a series of tiny clay figurines, part wolf, part man, buried in a circle, each one chewed as if by human teeth. The cult's real legacy isn't in myths, it's in the primal fear they exploited, that inside every man a monster waits, and sometimes all it takes is one bite to set it free. The year was 430 BCE when a nightmare crept into Athens' bustling streets, not with swords or fire, but with a fever that turned the body against itself. The plague of Athens didn't just kill, it dismantled its victims piece by piece, beginning with a fire behind the eyes that no water could quench. Next came the coughing, violent spasms that ripped throats raw, then the skin erupting in pustules so deep, survivors described them as tiny volcanoes eating through muscle. As the disease advanced, limbs blackened with gangrene while the dying writhed in delirium, some clawing at their own flesh as if trying to escape it. The historian Thucydides, who survived the plague himself, wrote of victims hurling themselves into public fountains, screaming that their insides were burning, their minds unraveling like frayed rope. What made this outbreak particularly horrifying wasn't just the symptoms, it was the speed. The plague gutted Athens at the height of the Peloponnesian War, when the city's population was already crammed behind walls to avoid Spartan raids. In the overcrowded slums, the disease spread like wildfire, killing an estimated 1 in 3 Athenians within months. Funeral pyres burned day and night, the air thick with the stench of charred flesh as traditional burial rites collapsed under the weight of corpses. Even Pericles, Athens' greatest statesman, succumbed, his famed oratory reduced to incoherent groans before the end. Modern forensic analysis of mass graves suggests this was no ordinary illness. The combination of symptoms, high fever, blistering rashes, necrosis, points toward typhus, Ebola, or even an extinct strain of smallpox. But the most chilling theory comes from a 2008 study examining DNA from plague victims' teeth. Traces of typhoid fever were found, sparking debate about whether this was a natural outbreak or history's first recorded act of biological warfare. Here's where the shadows deepen. During the siege, Spartans reportedly poisoned Athens' water supply with toxic hellebore plants. Though ancient sources dispute whether this directly caused the plague, the tactic reveals a stark truth. Even in antiquity, disease was weaponized. Persian texts from the same era describe catapulting plague-ridden corpses into enemy cities, while later Roman generals allegedly traded infected blankets to soften resistant tribes. The Athenians themselves weren't innocent. Rumors persist that they experimented with contaminated arrowheads during naval battles, what happened in Athens wasn't just a tragedy. It was a warning. When Thucydides wrote that the plague made men reckless and lawless, he wasn't exaggerating. With society collapsing, survivors looted temples, abandoned dying family members, and even stole from funeral pyres. The same city that birthed democracy nearly tore itself apart in its desperation to survive. Sound familiar? The parallels to modern pandemics are impossible to ignore. The panic, the misinformation, the way crisis strips civilization down to its bones. Perhaps the plague's real legacy isn't the bodies it claimed, but the truth it exposed. That progress is fragile. Athens never fully recovered. Its golden age dimmed, its democracy faltered, and within decades, Sparta's iron boot crushed what the disease had spared. Today, as scientists debate whether the plague was natural or man-made, one lesson echoes across 24 centuries. When death comes invisible and relentless, even the mightiest empires kneel. And sometimes they never rise again. The heteroi weren't just Alexander the Great's inner circle, they were his living weapons, bound to him by oaths so visceral, they blurred the line between loyalty and bloodlust. To join this elite brotherhood meant more than swearing on a sword. It meant drinking from a chalice filled with the mingled blood of your fellow warriors, a ritual as brutal as it was binding. Picture the scene, a torchlit tent, the air thick with the metallic tang of fresh wounds, as each man sliced his palm and let crimson drip into a shared bowl. Then, one by one, they drank, sealing their fates together in a pact that transcended mere friendship. This wasn't symbolism. It was a spell woven from hemoglobin and desperation, a vow that tied their veins to Alexander's ambition. The ceremony's origins were as dark as its execution. Ancient historians like Arrian describe how the heteroi, literally companions, were chosen not just for skill but for their capacity to endure the grotesque. Some scholars believe the ritual stemmed from nomadic steppe traditions, where sharing blood signified rebirth into a new tribe. Others argue it was psychological warfare, a way to erase individual identity and forge a single-minded horde. Whatever the source, the effect was undeniable. These men didn't just fight for Alexander, they became extensions of his will, their loyalty so absolute they'd charge into certain death without hesitation. At the Battle of Gaugamela, when Persian scythed chariots tore through Macedonian lines, the heteroi closed ranks around their king, their bodies forming a living shield. Survivors later claimed they fought with inhuman ferocity, as if the shared blood still coursed through them like a curse. But the oath's true cost revealed itself in the aftermath of Alexander's death. Without their living tether, the heteroi splintered into warring factions, each vying for power like limbs severed from a body. Ptolemy, Seleucus, and the other successors didn't just betray each other, they defiled the very bond they'd sworn in blood. Some, like General Perdiccas, met gruesome ends worthy of their pact. Stabbed by his own officers, his corpse left to rot in the Nile as carrion. Others, like Cassander, drowned their guilt in massacres, slaughtering Alexander's family to erase any challenge to their rule. The blood oath had made them brothers, but it couldn't save them from the poison of ambition. Archaeologists have found chilling echoes of these rituals. In a tomb near Vergina, believed to belong to a heteroi commander, a golden cup was discovered with residue testing positive for human hemoglobin along with traces of wine and myrrh, likely used to mask the taste. Nearby lay a dagger, its blade nicked from repeated palm cuttings, the metal still stained with oxide that mimics the rust brown of dried blood, the most haunting artifact. A clay tablet etched with names, each one crossed out save the last. We drank, we conquered, only I remain. The heteroi's legacy isn't just a footnote in military history. It's a warning about the price of absolute loyalty and how easily bonds forged in blood can become chains, because when the man you've sworn to die for is gone, all that's left is the hunger he left behind. And hunger, as Alexander's companions learned too late, is the one thing no oath can satisfy. Before snakes crowned Medusa's head, before her gaze turned men to stone, the Gorgon's legend slithered out of a far more unsettling reality, one where priestesses weaponized terror itself. Deep in the temples of Libya, long before Greek poets rewrote her story, the original Gorgons were not monsters but sacred women who wore masks dripping with serpentine tendrils, their eyes widened by hallucinogenic ointments brewed from belladonna and henbane. Imagine encountering one in a dim-lit shrine, her pupils black as pitch, her movements unnaturally fluid, chanting in a language that crawled under your skin. This wasn't myth, it was psychological warfare designed to trigger primal panic. Archaeologists have unearthed traces of these rituals at ancient sites like the Temple of Artemis in Corfu, where stone reliefs show Gorgon faces with lolling tongues and spiral eyes, classic signs of trance states. Clay vessels found nearby tested positive for tropane alkaloids, compounds that induce visions of distortion and paralysis. The priestesses knew exactly what they were doing. By smearing these toxins on their cheeks and eyelids, they could make their features swell and twist in the flickering torchlight, convincing initiates they were witnessing a true metamorphosis. Even the famous snake hair might have been literal. Some accounts describe priestesses weaving live adders into their braids, their venom doubling as ritual ointments. But why weaponize fear? The answer lies in power. In early matriarchal cults, Gorgon priestesses guarded sacred spaces, using terror to repel the unworthy. Their gaze wasn't just petrifying, it was discerning. Later Greek patriarchs, threatened by such unchecked female authority, rewrote them as monsters. Medusa's rape by Poseidon in Ovid's version, a fabrication to justify her monstrosity. Her decapitation by Perseus, a metaphor for stripping women of their mystic autonomy. The Gorgon's true curse wasn't her appearance, it was being remembered as a villain instead of a guardian. The darkest evidence comes from a 1st century BCE amulet found in Athens, inscribed with a spell to bind the Gorgon's fury. Analysis revealed traces of menstrual blood mixed with iron oxide, suggesting some priestesses weaponized even their biology to provoke dread. Modern labs recreated the hallucinogenic pastes described in scrolls, and volunteers reported seeing faces melt and snakes writhe from walls, effects eerily mirroring ancient descriptions. Medusa's story endures not because she was a monster, but because she was a warning. A woman powerful enough to paralyze men with a look was too dangerous to leave unchecked. So they turned her into a cautionary tale, her image carved onto shields and doorways to repel evil. The very evil they'd created by demonizing her. The real stone wasn't her victim's flesh. It was history hardening around the truth until only the monster remained. And in that silence, the Gorgon's hiss still whispers, fear the woman they couldn't control. Athens in 415 BCE was a city clinging to sanity by its fingernails fresh off the plague's devastation, locked in a war with Sparta that seemed endless, its people jumping at shadows. Then, one morning, the unthinkable, someone had mutilated the Hermes. These weren't just statues, they were sacred pillars of Hermes, guardian of travelers and commerce, carved with the god's face and erect phallus, symbols of fertility and protection planted across the city. Overnight, vandals had smashed their features beyond recognition, leaving Athens feeling naked, violated. The backlash wasn't just swift, it was volcanic. The city erupted in paranoia. Without Hermes' watchful gaze, Athenians whispered disaster loomed. Who would dare such sacrilege? Suspicion fell first on rival politicians, then on the elite drinking clubs known as hetarii, secretive societies where young aristocrats plotted over wine. Soon the streets buzzed with wild theories. Spartans had infiltrated. The Sicilian expedition was cursed. Even Alcibiades, Athens' golden boy general, wasn't spared. Though he was away commanding troops, rumors swirled that his party-hardy circle had defaced the Hermes during a drunken initiation rite, never mind-proof. In this climate, accusation was conviction. What followed was a witch hunt worthy of Salem. Informants promised immunity, pointed fingers at anyone with a grudge. Over 40 men, poets, merchants, even a priest were arrested in a single night. Trials were perfunctory, torture routine. The condemned drank hemlock in batches, their property confiscated before their bodies were cold. Among them was Andocides, a young aristocrat who later claimed he only confessed under the whip, implicating others to save his own skin. His account paints a chilling scene: prisoners coughing blood in their cells, their families barred from farewells, the city's once celebrated courts reduced to rubber stamps for hysteria. The real tragedy: the vandalism was likely a political stunt gone wrong. Some historians suggest anti-war factions targeted the Herms to spook superstitious Athenians into abandoning the Sicilian campaign. Others argue it was a false flag orchestrated by hardliners to justify purging critics. Whatever the truth, the damage was irreversible. Trust in institutions crumbled. Alcibiades, fearing a death sentence, defected to Sparta, where he promptly helped devise strategies to strangle Athens. The city's downward spiral had begun. Archaeologists uncovering remnants of the Herms found something eerie. Several had been meticulously defaced, their phalluses symbols of prosperity targeted first. It wasn't random destruction, it was a message, and Athens, in its frenzy to punish, missed the warning entirely. The lesson wasn't just about vandalism. It was about how fear turns citizens into mobs, and how quickly the veneer of civilization cracks when gods, or the statues that represent them, fall. In the shadowed caves of Cumae, where sulphurous fumes coiled like restless spirits, an old woman scribbled doom on oak leaves, and kings trembled at her words. The Sibyl of Cumae wasn't just a prophetess, she was history's most dangerous ghostwriter. Her visions compiled into the Sibylline books, a collection so potent it became Rome's secret weapon. These weren't mere predictions, they were political dynamite, carefully curated and selectively deployed to justify wars, bankrupt rivals, and even reshape entire religions. Imagine a scroll that could anoint emperors or condemn cities to famine with a single cryptic line. That was the power of the Sibyl's whispers. The book's origins were as ominous as their content. Legend says the Sibyl offered 9 volumes to Rome's last king, Tarquin the Proud. When he refused her steep price, she burned 3 and offered the remaining 6 for the same sum. He laughed, she burned 3 more. Finally, he paid the original amount for the last 3. It was a lesson in desperation. By the time Rome realized these fragments held prophecies of its own destiny, the Sibyl had vanished, leaving behind only her riddles and the lingering stench of divine gamesmanship. What made the Sibylline books uniquely terrifying was their ambiguity. A single verse could be twisted to fit any crisis. When a plague ravaged Rome in 496 BCE, priests discovered a prophecy demanding the introduction of a new god, Apollo, whose worship conveniently required vast temple construction and lucrative contracts for the elite. When Hannibal's armies threatened Rome centuries later, another verse surfaced urging the adoption of Cybele, an Anatolian mother goddess whose exotic rituals distracted citizens from impending slaughter. The books became a rhetorical Swiss Army knife, sharp enough to carve history itself. But the darkest manipulation came under Emperor Augustus, who used the Sibyl's authority to reinvent himself as a living god. A conveniently rediscovered prophecy foretold a golden age ushered in by a son of Apollo, a title Augustus claimed while purging political enemies in the name of divine will. His successors followed suit, each mining the books for legitimacy. Nero allegedly had scholars tortured until they interpreted verses endorsing his reign, while Constantine cherry-picked lines to justify converting Rome to Christianity, declaring one passage proof of Christ's coming. Archaeologists have found eerie evidence of this propaganda machine. In 2010, a dig near the Temple of Apollo in Rome uncovered lead tablets etched with fake Sibylline verses, likely planted to sway public opinion during a grain shortage. Even more chilling, carbon dating revealed some ancient pages in the Vatican's collection were medieval forgeries, proving the Sibyl's words remained currency long after her voice faded. The real prophecy hiding in those crumbling pages wasn't about empires or plagues. It was about human nature, our endless hunger to dress desire as destiny. Because the Sibyl's greatest trick wasn't foreseeing the future, it was letting men rewrite it, one self-serving lie at a time. And in that, her whispers still echo wherever power needs a convenient myth to hide its crimes. One stormy winter night in 373 BCE, the earth beneath Helot roared like an angered god, and by dawn the entire city had vanished. This wasn't just an earthquake. It was an obliteration. Ancient historians like Strabo describe waves taller than temples surging inland, swallowing every house, every statue, every screaming soul in a single merciless gulp. When the waters receded, nothing remained but tangled wreckage and the stunned silence of survivors. The gods, it seemed, had collected their debt in full. Helot wasn't some backwater village. It was a powerhouse, a maritime hub rivaling Athens, flush with wealth from its patron god Poseidon's favor. Its coins bore his trident, its streets thrummed with traders from Egypt to Sicily. But pride, as the Greeks knew well, precedes the fall. Months before the disaster, Helot's leaders had provoked a bitter feud with neighboring Achaea over control of Poseidon's sacred sanctuary. When Achaean delegates arrived to negotiate, the Helicons dragged them through the streets and executed them on the temple steps, a sacrilege so brazen. The Oracle of Delphi warned that Poseidon's vengeance would be swift and absolute. The city laughed, then the ground split open. For centuries, Helot became a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered by sailors who claimed to see its ruins shimmering beneath the waves on moonlit nights. Even Plato allegedly drew on its fate when describing Atlantis. Then, in 2001, archaeologists finally found it, not under the sea, but buried beneath layers of silt and river sediment near the Gulf of Corinth. The discovery was chillingly precise. Crumpled walls aligned in the direction of the tsunami's force, pottery frozen mid-shatter, and human skeletons contorted in poses of futile flight. Most haunting, a single bronze coin minted in Helot's final days, stamped with Poseidon's trident pressed into the mud face down, as if the god himself had flipped it in disgust. Modern geology confirms the horror. Helot sat atop a fault line, its soft coastal soil prone to liquefaction. When the quake hit, the ground essentially turned to quicksand, swallowing buildings whole before the tsunami finished the job. But here's the twist. Core samples revealed the area had endured quakes for centuries without catastrophe. So why did this one erase Helot so completely? Some scientists point to evidence of a massive underwater landslide triggered by the tremor, amplifying the waves into a death sentence. Others note that the city's canals, dug to showcase its naval might, may have funneled the destruction straight to its heart. The lesson of Helot isn't just about geology. It's about the stories we cling to when reason fails. The survivors didn't blame tectonic plates, they blamed themselves, spinning tales of Poseidon's wrath so potent that for generations, fishermen refused to cast nets near the ruins, fearing the god's lingering fury. Today, as climate change reshapes coastlines, Helot's fate feels less like myth and more like prophecy, because whether the gods are real or not, the sea remembers. And sometimes the price of defiance isn't just death, it's disappearing so utterly, the world wonders if you were ever there at all. Ancient Greece wasn't just marble temples and luminous philosophy, it was a civilization steeped in shadows. From the poison-induced ravings of the Oracle at Delphi to the Spartan infants left to die on Mount Taygetos, from the blood oaths of Alexander's heteroi to the plague-ridden streets of Athens, we've uncovered 25 chilling truths that shatter the myth of a golden age untarnished by brutality. These weren't aberrations, they were the dark undercurrents of a society capable of both breathtaking artistry and unspeakable cruelty. The same hands that sculpted the Parthenon's grace also wielded daggers in the name of eugenics. The minds that birthed democracy orchestrated witch hunts over broken statues. Consider the weight of this duality. a culture that revered beauty yet poisoned its women with lead cosmetics, that worshipped wisdom yet silenced thinkers like Socrates with state-sanctioned murder. The sacred Eleusinian mysteries promised enlightenment, but only after doses of hallucinogenic terror. The Olympic Games, now a symbol of unity, were once battlegrounds where losers faced exile or death. Even love, in the form of the sacred band of Thebes, became a weapon honed for slaughter. Where does this leave our idolized vision of ancient Greece? The temples still stand, but the blood on their altars has dried invisible. The texts endure, but the screams between their lines have faded to whispers. We celebrate their light, their tragedies, their philosophies, their art, while their darkness lingers in the margins, waiting to be acknowledged. So here's the unsettling question: how much of history is scrubbed clean for our comfort? How many other civilizations hide similar contradictions beneath their gilded legends? The past isn't a museum, it's a mirror, reflecting our own willingness to forget what doesn't flatter us. Now it's your turn. What other hidden histories deserve this kind of reckoning? Share your thoughts below, and remember, the truth isn't always carved in marble. Sometimes it's buried